All right, everyone, the fear-mongering continues. I see more news stories now making a big deal about Donald Trump's comments with regards to NATO. And they keep making up, out of thin air, the concept that Donald Trump is anti-NATO. He's serious about leaving NATO. He's going to abandon our allies. And then, despite the fact that France and Britain have nuclear weapons, somehow they magically become defenseless. And Russia will take over the world, and that's what Trump wants because he's pro-Russia and stuff like that. The thing is, it's all just a dovetail. The Trump NATO propaganda that we're seeing over his critical statements with regards to the military spending of some member states need to be seen in proper context. When Donald Trump was president of the United States, he encouraged NATO allies and balked at continuing to fully fund things because they weren't meeting their spending goals, the generally agreed upon 2% of GDP margin for their militaries. Part of the problem has actually gone away because about a half a dozen of the countries within NATO now are meeting that target because as a reaction to Russia invading Ukraine. So half the alliance is now paid up. So that half, Trump, why would he abandon them? They're meeting their stated target. They're not taking any money from the U.S. particularly. They're meeting their goals. They're innovating, developing weapons. They also use some of that money to buy from the United States, etc., etc., etc. That's point number one. Point number two, only a complete fool would think that Donald Trump would withdraw from NATO unilaterally because he'd immediately be removed from office, even if he didn't like NATO. And personally, I see him as pro-Western. I'll get into the dovetailing in a moment. Even if he did have a stick up his ass for NATO and was a Russian plant or something like that, which he's clearly not, he wouldn't get away with it. It wouldn't be physically possible. There's no methodology by which he could pull that off politically and survive politically. Now, the dovetailing is it originates with the Clinton campaign and the original Russiagate smears. The idea is that any claim about Trump in regards to diplomacy, foreign policy, etc., no matter how hyperbolic and asinine and stupid it may be, is automatically true because he's a Russian asset. Again, I would point out that we have a credible report that Donald Trump threatened to bomb the Russians if they invaded Ukraine. He is not Putin's lapdog. If anything, he's one of the few world leaders who can actually go over there and get something done in negotiation because he's one of the few that doesn't come from the aristocratic or lawyer class. Trump comes from a business background. He's done business in Russia. He's had to deal with Russian magnates and understands how that culture works. It's not the same as negotiations in the West. He carries that over into the NATO sphere and attempts to press them into paying more. How does it make NATO weaker or cause it to dissolve simply asking for a bit more money to be put in by the member states? It makes it stronger. It's also good for the United States. When they're meeting their spending totals, they're buying a bunch of shit from the United States because we're a major arms dealer in the world. Might buy some AKs from China too from time to time. You never know. The money cycles around and it benefits the entire alliance. It strengthens the West. It strengthens the world's largest military alliance. It doesn't weaken it. No, weakening it would be what's happened before. Say, hey, decadent Europeans are taking advantage of us. We guard the sea lanes and they're not really paying into the pot. That's okay. We don't need to address that right now. Obama never addressed it. Biden doesn't address it, although it's less of a problem, again, in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine. Again, more member states are ponying up more. In fact, some of them are ahead of that goal. The Polish and a few others, Estonia and some of these other Eastern European states especially. Obama never raised the issue. Bush never really raised the issue. Going back to the dawn of NATO, originally people were taking it seriously because, you had the Cold War mentality going on. When the Soviet Union collapsed, all of a sudden the NATO countries fell into decadence and disrepair in a military sense. You have European nations with huge amounts of wealth with totally anemic military capabilities. We're talking like, our country of 10 million people has like 2 tanks and stuff like that. It doesn't make any sense for the United States to simply be expected to perpetually haul the entire alliance on its own. Basically, NATO devolved into the U.S. guarding a bunch of other nations. It doesn't need to be that way, though. There needs to be reciprocity involved again. That's all Trump's saying. When he says, well, I'm not going to defend you if the Russians attack you and you're not meeting your spending goals. Basically, it's meet your spending goals. That's all that's being asked. Well, in any of the countries that are coming in below that, you wouldn't need to pony up that much more money to hit the fucking spending goals. You get a few more troops, a few more tanks, etc. You can buy them made in the USA, and you definitely should. Leopard tank's pretty cool too, whatever. How is this going to weaken the West? If anything, if you're worried about Russia invading NATO, which is not going to happen at least anytime soon, unless you let it fall into disrepair, what you need to do is flex the muscle. You need bigger militaries. And again, these countries have gotten to the point where there's been a protracted period of time in which they've been on generally stable footing, again, after the end of the Cold War. For decades, there's no fighting or anything. Open borders and, grab a wine or a beer, depending on which part of Europe you're in, or some teppanyaki maybe, and you don't have to worry too much. The nations, by the way, on the margins, geographically, are always the ones that pay more. So Turkey, for example. Turkey has a beefy military. Well, I mean, you look at where it's located and who some of its neighbors are, you can probably understand why that's the case. Poland, for example. Poland remembers being invaded from both sides over and over again for centuries, being behind the Iron Curtain and suffering under communism, etc. So they're reluctant to let their military become anemic. Meanwhile, you have a nation like Sweden, or the Netherlands, actually. Their military capabilities are incommensurate with their GDP, with their population size, with their output, with their capabilities, with their wealth in general. The Netherlands is probably the greatest example. I think they've got 8 fighter jets and 4 tanks, if I remember correctly. The Netherlands is one of the biggest economic muscles disproportionately in the whole goddamn world. It's one of the wealthiest nations in the world. You've got little Middle Eastern oil microstates that have 10 times that military power, despite not even having the same level of output. Dude, Amsterdam's basically the banking capital of the world at this point. The population growth rate is enormous. Yet the military remains roughly the same. The spending's just not there. And so you have all of these various examples. Trump is fundamentally correct. Nothing that he's proposing or has proposed in the last days, where he's making remarks on NATO again, ill-advised as though some of those remarks admittedly would be. He had to know that he was giving ammo to people to criticize him with the Russia bullshit. He's fundamentally correct. Nothing that he's saying would weaken NATO. You're saying that spending more money on your military is going to make you weaker. That's completely contradictory. It makes absolutely no sense. Trump is pro-NATO, but he's pro-NATO that doesn't cost the United States $1 trillion zillion, while everyone else just sort of sits on their ass and lets us do all of the work. That's about all. Peace out.